So, you know, maybe at this stage now, it's quieting down just a little bit in terms of those people trying to come in. So I think we have the bulk of those who are trying to get in, they have joined us. So rather than holding us up any longer, we might actually begin our meeting this evening. And just to let you know that we've muted everybody just to facilitate an easy participation and an easy presentation this evening, but that when the speakers are making their point or when they're saying their piece, they might like to unmute. But first of all, I'd just like to wish you all a very good evening and to take this opportunity to now, I too am muted, so that's my mistake sorted. But just to wish you all a very good evening and to take this opportunity to welcome you to our important webinar that's been hosted by AEFJN Irish Antenna. That's the Africa, Europe, Faith and Justice Network, and concerns specifically the subject of corporate accountability and human rights as we respond to abuses in Africa. My name is Brian O'Toole, and I work at the Justice Desk for the Presentation Sisters, and we are one of the congregations that are affiliated.
Okay.
Okay.
No, I know.
We're one of the congregations that are affiliated to the AEFJN Ireland. So over the course of the next 80 to 90 minutes, you'll hear from two distinguished speakers who will speak on the experience of corporate human rights abuses in Africa and why there is an urgent need for corporate accountability legislation. We will then outline an action that we hope you will undertake and indeed share with others. That's the aim this evening. So just a few words of housekeeping. As you're aware, we will unmute participants as they enter the webinar to facilitate, as I say, an uninterrupted presentation. In this way, all the presenters will just have to unmute before they begin. It is our intention to record, and you will have noticed that as you entered. So we're going to record the webinar, and over the course of the next few days, we will come back to you with the recording and the action, the associated slides and the letter that we hope to show you a little bit later on. So you'll have it all in the one link. So we hope too that if you have a question during this webinar, then we'd encourage you to put your question into the chat function below. And between myself and Jerry Ford, who's the Justice Officer at the SMAs, you see him somewhere on the screen there, we will, given time, get through as many of these questions as possible. But we'll also be saving the chat to be sure that there's nothing that we lose of this webinar. So before we begin again, just to thank you very much for taking the time to be with us this evening. I would like to begin this evening by introducing Tony Pike. Tony is the Justice Officer at AMRI, the Association of Leaders of Missionaries of the Religious of Ireland. And Tony will tell you a little bit more about AMRI, and specifically, Tony will introduce AEFJN Ireland. Tony is also working hard this evening as the host of our webinar. So Tony, thank you very much indeed for all that you are about to do and all that you are doing. So Tony, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Brian. Thank you. And welcome everybody. Thanks for taking the time out this evening to on a Tuesday evening where the sun is shining here to join us. You're very, very welcome. As Brian noted, I am the Justice, Peace and Ecology Coordinator with the Association of Leaders of Missionaries and Religious of Ireland, that we affectionately call AMRI. For those who may not know, AMRI is a member organisation that represents and promotes active collaboration and solidarity between religious institutes, societies of apostolic life, and lay mission organisations both here in Ireland and overseas. One part of this collaborative mission is to respond to what Pope Francis appropriately phrases the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. The AMRI Justice Desk, where I sit, seeks to be an active voice for a more just and equitable world on behalf of AMRI and its members. And we do this by working collaboratively and collectively in raising awareness and facilitating pastoral responses to local and global realities as they relate to justice, peace, and ecology throughout the world. One such important and revived collaboration is the Africa, Europe, Faith and Justice Network. In Ireland, the AEFJN Ireland Antenna, which is the Ireland branch. And I say revived because AEFJN in Ireland began in 1993 and was intensely active until 2016. Very briefly, AEFJN is an international network of religious congregations who focus on promoting economic justice between the European Union and Sub-Saharan Africa. The current Irish branch, which was set up nearly a year ago, is a collaboration of 9 religious congregations and AMRI. Our work focuses on awareness raising, advocacy, and taking action on key human rights and human dignity as they relate to corporate injustices and abuses of human rights in Africa. This webinar is a collaborative effort. It not only raises awareness of the impunity of global corporate structures that facilitate and profit from injustice on the continent, it also demonstrates that each and every one of us, collectively and in solidarity with those impacted, can demand justice. I urge you to please listen to and hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, which are both at the mercy of corporate greed, and to be that voice of justice. Thank you very much for attending again. And Brian, I'm going to hand back over to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, and thanks very much indeed for that introduction to AMRI and indeed the introduction to AEFJN Ireland. So without much further ado then, I'm going to introduce you to Father Kevin O'Hara. We're delighted to be able to welcome Father Kevin, who's currently in Donegal, as a member of St. Patrick's Missionary Society. He's a well-known activist in the area of human rights, rule of law, democracy, and peace in Nigeria. And Father Kevin this evening has been asked to tell us his experience of corporate human rights abuses in Africa and how it impacts on his work. Father Kevin, you're most welcome this evening. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Brian, and lovely to be here this evening. I spotted a lady in the background. Her name is Denise. Denise, I hope you are hearing me. Denise Boyle, who came to visit us in the Niger Delta, worked with St. Patrick's Missionaries, and it's lovely to see you tonight, Denise. Now, this network, African Europe Faith and Justice Network, I am very delighted to learn about it and how I wish I had been able to collaborate before with this network, because I believe this is the kind of network that makes a difference. It's a network that can use its leverage to bring about change and with regards to corporate practice in places like Nigeria and other parts of Africa. I have a few suggestions at the end of this talk, and I can share with you what I would love the network to do or to follow up with. So, but I'm very grateful for this invitation to talk to you tonight. It's just to tell my story, because my story was I became a missionary to preach God's word, but I found myself in West Africa, Nigeria, and my ecological conversion began in the year 1990 on a particular day. I happened to be driving to visit a friend in the Niger Delta and a colleague, and I ran into a roadblock, and this particular roadblock was set up by men and women and youths of a village, and they had 20 oil and gas locations in their community. And they decided the time had come to block the road, to block the oil company from coming in, because they were tired of what was going on and they felt they were not benefiting from this industry in their midst. So the oil company decided to write a letter to the police commissioner, and he asked that mobile police should come and put down this protest. And truly they came, and they spent 5 days putting down the protest. And by the end of the operation, over 80 people were killed, including the traditional ruler, members of his family, the pastor of a local church, men, women, and children. And the village was ransacked by mobile police. no one to this day, and this is the year 2022, has ever been held accountable for that tragedy, that massacre. And this is one of many such incidents in the Niger Delta over the years since this oil company started exploring for oil since 1957. And that's why I'm very interested to hear that this African network, Europe Faith, Justice and Network, is interested in business and human rights, because it is a critical issue in the Niger Delta and elsewhere throughout the continent of Africa. So I providentially happened to meet with the group in the year 1994, another network, and I believe networks are important because they have power and influence and leverage. This network was the Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility in the UK, a coalition of churches. You had Baptists, Anglicans, Catholics, Methodists. All of them came together, and what they had in common was they all invested their money in Shell Oil Company. So they decided that they would, as a coalition, they would go and meet with the company and have a dialogue, and this dialogue continues to today. And they invited me to join with them. That was way back in 1994, and that was the beginning of my journey with the ECCR, and we found that their shareholder leverage was huge in bringing about incremental change, small wins, never big wins, small wins, but we are content with small wins. Now, for example, they Council demanded from Shell to bring an audit of their operations with regards to community development in the 1,500 host communities in the Niger Delta. So Shell produced this audit, huge audit, giving the names of the projects, the type of the projects, the costs of the projects, locations, etc. So I was invited by ECCR to go and check out these projects on the ground in the Delta. And I spent 3 days with Shell Oil Company, and we traveled far and wide in the Delta using a helicopter. And truly I met and I saw and I witnessed that there were pilot projects, expensive projects with regards to health and education and so on, agriculture. And after the 3 days, I decided to go on my own and find out how things were in places where there were no pilot projects. And my first port of call was to go back to Umuechim, where the massacre took place. And I discovered that there were projects there, but they were not functioning. And that there was on the audit, they had described this tar road, and I could see no tarred road. And I came to the conclusion that there were many such projects in communities where there was a lot of corruption going on in the company. And this was, it was showing the company in bad light. So our report back to the shareholders brought a result within a few months. The director or the company manager for community development was given and was sacked, and he was replaced with a world-renowned expert in community sustainable development. Now that was huge. That's the power of leverage, and that's the impact of a group or a network prepared to engage with the companies and prepared to monitor their businesses on the ground. They can have a very important impact. The same Ecumenical Council, they decided to, in the year 1996, to bring a shareholder resolution before their annual general meeting. And they asked that the company would have the same standards in the Niger Delta as they have in the UK. Now, the resolution was rejected because the directors pointed out, if you want to have those same standards in Nigeria as you have in the UK, those people, the shareholders, you will not enjoy your dividends. That money would have to be brought to the Niger Delta, and you would have to upgrade facilities and standards there. So it was a case that the shareholders rejected that particular resolution. Why? Because they didn't want to give their dividend and send it to Africa for having equal standards. Again, 10 years later, in the year 2006, the same ecumenical council brought a resolution before the shareholders at the annual general meeting in The Hague, and they asked again for an improvement in the standards of Shell's operations and activities in the Niger Delta. And again, once again, the directors informed the shareholders that they shouldn't do that, rejected, because they insist that they operate with the highest international standards, and that they also complement this with their own principles and their own values, their company values. They have values like people before profits, that people and the earth, that they focus on people first and the dignity of people, and truth. Truth is a very important value for the company. So I decided to put these values and principles to the test. In 2012, I went to Bayelsa State, which is one of the Niger Delta states. I formed a small group called Stakeholders Alliance for Corporate Accountability. And we went to Bayelsa because there in that state, Shell had their multi-billion-dollar integrated oil and gas gathering project. Now, to help you to understand what that is about, for many years, over 50 years, Shell were flaring the gas, burning off the gas, wasting it, and causing a negative impact on the ozone layer. But now they have found that if you process the gas and it becomes liquefied natural gas, then it becomes a very expensive commodity, a very profitable commodity for them. And that is what the facility is all about. It impacts 92 communities. So I and my colleagues, we went there. I lived there for 2 years to visit all the communities, go around looking at their standards. And we had the criteria we used was given to us by a Professor John Ruge, who is an expert on these matters. And some of his criteria would be accountability, transparency, accessibility, and so on. So we evaluated all their activities using his criteria. And interestingly, we found that they didn't make the mark at all. They were very poor in many of their standards. And we would write up the results, and we would present them to the shareholders in the UK, ECCR, and it caused a lot of tension with the oil company. They felt we were being unfair. We were not giving them credit for their efforts. However, we have the evidence on the ground to show that their standards were poor. For example, we found a lake which was polluted for over 8 years. As the pipeline was sabotaged by local people nearby, and the oil poured into the lake for weeks and weeks and weeks. It was a saturated lake. Many NGOs had brought it to the attention of Shell, but they never came to clean it up. And yet they have a principle that they will clean up all spills, even if it is sabotage. They say we have a responsibility to clean up if it is equipment failure, their own failure, but also they have a principle that says we will clean up all oil spills. However, in this case, they hadn't done it, and in many other cases, they didn't do it either. However, once again, because we brought it to the attention of this network, they were embarrassed that we brought out the information, we filmed, we documented, and we brought it to the attention of ECCR. And within weeks, Shell came to the lake and they brought what we call these swamp buggies. And they had to clean out all the hydrocarbon that had gone down to the bottom of the lake. And they dug it out and they brought it out and they exposed it to the sun to be burned off, what they call natural attenuation. And that was one of the small wins that we had. We were very pleased. But again, we acknowledge that it was down to shareholder leverage and the power of a network that were working on our side and that we were connected to. We challenged Shell about their central processing facility, where they do their processing. They pour their effluent into the local river, the River Nun. For 2 to 3 years, we challenged them about the constituents of the effluent, and they continually ignored the issue until eventually they said it was hydrocarbon, but it was only 1 part to a million. But again, in the River Nun, the local people, they drink that water, they bathe in that water, they use that water all the time, and we believe it was detrimental to their health. Likewise, the gas flaring, there are still flares in the area. Those flares, we believe, are detrimental to people's health as well, because we look at the vegetation nearby and we could see that trees were dying and foliage and grasses were all dying because of the heat of this particular gas flare. And we also noticed that in houses, the windows would be shaking at nighttime. If you are in the house, the windows keep shaking. The people were very disturbed. Shell responded by saying they have a professor who came and he did tests and he did experiments, and he came to the conclusion that there were no detrimental effects on people's health. However, they never brought us the report. We did not see any report to show the professor's his conclusions. Truth is something that multinationals find difficult, and Shell particularly. There was an oil spill that went into a creek called Taylor Creek, and when it was brought to their attention by the state government, they denied that that this spill ever occurred. Unfortunately for Shell, that is myself and my group, we went there and we filmed this particular spill into the creek. And unfortunately also, it's a designated conservation area, this particular area, Taylor Creek. And it's an area where oil companies like Shell and Ajib are both operating, and there have been huge spills going into the area. It has been very tragic. So they denied the spill, but we were able to prove that the spill occurred. They also refused to give compensation according to what the federal government or state government were asking them to do. They went behind the backs of the government and they paid very small amounts of money to 24 communities that were impacted by the spill. Truth, again, was the issue in the Baton oil spill. Baton oil was a spill where the company prejudged the cause of the spill. They sent the names of 7 young men to the state government and said, these are the young men who committed a sabotage of their pipeline. But in actual fact, that never happened. We were able to prove that that it was to do with a equipment failure. Their own pipeline had been having problems over the years. We were able to prove that, and we were able to get the company to compensate the community for that. Another particular spill where, again, we proved that they did not clean it up. We were able to bring the deputy managing director from London to come to the spill and see it for himself. And we found out that the American contractor, cleanup contractor, he said he never received funds. Only the funds he received was for the spill point. The other area, according to the deputy manager director, that it should be left for the sun, the heat of the sun to clean it, natural attenuation. So that particular spill and our work that we did with regards to the spill was taken up by an organization called SERAP. They brought it to the African Court of Human Rights, and they sued the company Shell for the spill. The court, the African court, said they don't have jurisdiction to sue a multinational corporation like Shell. But what they did do, they found Nigeria guilty of failing to protect the environment and its peoples through the operations of Shell. Unfortunately, the country was being, the president of the country was a local man from that Bayelsa state, President Goodluck Jonathan, but he had very little interest in the activities of environmental issues in his own state. It was very, very discouraging. So we discovered that the federal government and the state governments in Bayelsa, they do not have the funds to protect the oil and gas communities, to ensure protection from the abuses. The controller of the federal environmental ministry in Bayelsa, he has a small office. If he wants to send a message to his headquarters in Abuja, he comes out to a cyber cafe. He waits there every day, sitting in the office, waiting for an oil company to come and call him and bring him to an issue and to pay him and look after him. So it's quite obvious that he is incompetent, that the ministry is incompetent. And likewise for another agency called NOSDRA, which is the Nigerian Oil Spill and Detection and Remediation Agency. This is a very critical agency that's supposed to be there to protect the environment and protect the communities. They have no money, so they depend on Shell to give them money to do what they call laboratory tests for oil spills. They're the ones that they're compromised because they cannot tell the truth about these matters because they are receiving funds from Shell to do the testing of soil and water. The most disturbing report about the Niger Delta in recent years has come from the St. Gallen University in Switzerland. A research team came and they concluded that thousands of children die every year due to the proximity to oil spills.
16,000.
So I personally challenged the research team, the authors of the report, and they say they stand by their research findings, that thousands of children are dying every year in the Niger Delta due to proximity to oil spills. I found that disturbing, and I brought it to the attention of the oil company, oil majors in the Delta. They said they are looking into the matter. So we set up a very special project for child safeguarding, and we made this as a central issue that we must try to bring awareness to communities that are known to them. This danger is around because oil spills are in every community due to a lot to do with leaking pipes because of old age, but very often due to sabotage of pipelines by the youths in the community. They are looking for cleanup contracts and so on. So our project for child safeguarding now is to try to create awareness, try to help them to understand that this is very, very dangerous behavior. We have also a tragic situation where the youths are processing their own oil. They steal the oil from the pipelines, they cook it, and they sell it to the local community at a cheaper rate than the normal rates. So people are promoting this kind of illegal bunkering and refining. Tragically, in the last month or so, over 100 people were incinerated when it exploded. One of these refineries, very crude buildings, exploded, and over 100 people were incinerated in Imo State, which is part of the Niger Delta. So
Just
we
another minute
present,
or so, Kevin, if that's okay.
how many minutes?
Just another minute or so. You're in flying.
Okay,
forward.
okay.
Very much.
Just finally, one of the oil majors that is operating there is an Italian company called Agip, and they have a poor record on regards to human rights and environment, but they have agreed now they will collaborate with us, our local NGO, to see if there's any way we can improve their situation with regards to the human rights and environment, and that we will report our findings every quarter to the United Nations Business Forum in Geneva. This is a very challenging project, trying to collaborate with the multinational. We are going to be using the National Human Rights Commission to be with us. We're going to try to get all the ministries to work together to see how can we find ways to try and improve, try to do something to change the way things are happening, particularly with regards to human rights, where security forces are very rough, very violent, and very often engage in extrajudicial killing. So we have a 3-year project. We hope to get involved with that. We are actually started the project, but it's in a conflict zone, and we hope to be able to get small wins. And I'm now interested in to see how we might be able to get the African Europe Faith and Justice Network to collaborate with us as well. They may be able to help us and find new ways, and particularly to help us find out those shareholder groups that are still out there. These are pension groups who invest in these companies. They can easily help us. But last and not least, that you can reach out to the Anglican Church in the UK. They own 20% of Shell, shares of Shell. So they have a huge influence in that company. Justin Welby is their man. And I think if your network was to sit down with him, there may be some future there. And last is that I would love you to identify ways of helping to advocate for this, what they call the regulating corporate behavior through liability insurance. Liability insurance is a new concept. Maybe Gary might know something about it, and we'll talk more about it later. But that is an area that I believe your network can do much work and help us on the ground to bring about more small wins, short wins. I'll leave it there for now, and you can ask questions.
That's perfect. Father Kevin, thank you very much indeed. And you've given us so much really to think about. Indeed, plenty of asks as well, but you've offered us a very rich context of exactly what your experience is. I know too that you have a number of photographs that might actually outline or show us the scene. And I think your colleague was going to show us a PowerPoint of just some photographs. If he wants to set those up, and in the meantime, what I might do is encourage anybody who's watching in, if you have any questions for Father Kevin around his input this evening, and indeed there's been an awful lot said in terms of the Niger Delta and some of the abuses and some of the deaths, a lot of which I wasn't aware of myself or didn't even know, and some of it actually is quite shocking. So maybe while your colleague sets up that, maybe we can just watch quietly as you flick through the photographs. We might just give you a minute for this because we are kind of running to time, but we did want to give everybody a sense of where those photographs were. So thank you indeed for that. So you just run those there for us, please. Thanks very much indeed.
Display now. Okay, that's good. That's good.
Thank you both very much indeed for Father Kevin for the wonderful presentation, really, which was very, very rich, and for your colleague there for the photographs, because they really do set the scene for us. And what I liked about the photographs was there was everybody in it. There was family, there was community, there was industry, there was activism, and it certainly does add to the presentation that you gave. So once again, Father Kevin, thank you very much indeed. And again, for anybody watching in, if you have a question that you would like to put to Father Kevin, maybe feel free to put them into the chat, and we will definitely come to them in a few moments' time. So once again, Father Kevin, thank you very much indeed for that lovely input. At this stage of the evening, I'd like to move on maybe just to look at some of the policy responses that come from the Irish Coalition of Business and Human Rights, the ICBHR. And to explain what all of this means, I have the pleasure of introducing Gary Walsh, who leads Trócra's policy on and advocacy work on business and human rights. He has a keen interest in corporate accountability and advancing stronger regulations to end corporate human rights and harms. I've been looking very much to Gary's input today. So Gary, you're very, very welcome, and thanks for taking the time to be with us this evening. So Gary, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you so much for giving me the privilege of being able to speak this evening, and thanks for everyone who's tuned in. It's incredible to see how many people have turned out on a Tuesday evening to listen to this topic, and I'm sure there are many people who are very passionate about this issue of corporate accountability and corporate involvement in abuses of human rights and damage to the environment. And particularly thanks to Father Kevin for outlining what's happening in the Niger Delta, and a very kind of raw and visceral account of the damage that can be done by companies like Shell. And I think, you know, we're all really linked to this. Like, we all consume oil and the petrol that runs our cars, and I think this is why this issue connects with people, because in our global economy, we are all connected through the products we consume, unfortunately, to some really serious issues, human rights issues. Like, here's my mobile phone. It's quite possible that some of the metals in my phone have been mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo, possibly by children. Here's an orange. Apparently it's from Morocco. I don't know the people who picked these fruits, were they paid a living wage? The clothes I'm wearing, they may have been produced in a garment factory in Southeast Asia. There could be labor rights abuses and exploitation in those factories. So I think this issue of corporate accountability connects with all of us, and we all have maybe a responsibility, but it isn't an issue of injustice far away that we can forget about. And I think that's why a lot of people are angry and increasingly care more about sustainability and human rights issues in the products that we consume. So in my work for Trócra, I'm focused on policy and advocacy related to this area of corporate accountability. I've worked with many different hats over the years with Trócra. I'm with Trócra 11 years, and I've lived in Malawi, I've lived in Myanmar, I've managed Trócra's work in Israel and the Palestinian territories for a number of years. So I've seen firsthand, I've spent a lot of time with communities on the front lines of corporate exploitation, and I've had the privilege to sit with them and hear a number of their stories. And these days I'm in Ireland, and I for my sins I spend a lot of time trying to convince politicians to care about these issues and to take action on these issues. And I think one of the key things we want to discuss and maybe take away from this evening is how we could all take action and put pressure on our politicians. As Father Kevin has rightly outlined, when we come together, we have more power. And someone like myself, who's in and out talking to TDs a lot, TDs will care when there's public interest, when there's a lot of us coming together and bringing our voices together. They're more likely to take action. So I'm just going to share my screen and just show you a few slides and a few photographs. So let me just, hopefully the technology will work for me. Hopefully this is now working. So as Brian mentioned, I'm here with my Trócaire hat on, but also representing the Irish Coalition for Business and Human Rights. And this is a coalition including the Africa Europe Faith and Justice Network of over 20 Irish organizations. And you can see the logos there. We're a new coalition. We're just over a year old. And we've come together to try and have a public campaign and advocate with our government to take stronger action on the issue of business and human rights. As I mentioned, I've had the privilege of traveling around the world a lot and meeting some people. So I just thought I'd show you a few photographs. This is a lady I met in Turkana in the north of Kenya. Her name was Nadiko. And Turkana is a very dry, arid, hot region of the north of Kenya. And when I was there, I think it was 3 summers ago, they were experiencing a drought, and due to climate change, there's recurring droughts. They told me that it used to be every 5 years, then it became every 2 years. Now it's nearly every year. And at present, they're really facing an extreme crisis. But this lady from an indigenous community and her community were very poor and on the margins. They were living right next to an oil installation and roads that were built through communal land that they would graze their herds of goats on. And there was an Irish/UK company, Tullow Oil, that was building these oil installations and extracting oil. And she said to me that every day they would see these trucks roll by with oil being transported to the Kenyan coastline, and that they weren't benefiting from this oil. And there was a real anger that I could feel from talking to her and her community. And they're not alone. There's many communities around the world who live right next to great natural wealth, yet don't benefit from that wealth, and often are exploited, and often their land is taken from them. And so often this is referred to as the resource curse. If I can venture outside of Africa for a minute, this is a lady I met in Honduras. Bertita Cáceres is her name, and her mother was murdered, along with 7 other community members, for standing up against corporate interests. So again, these were an indigenous community living next to natural wealth. They were trying to defend their river, the Rio Blanco, which is sacred to their community, where a Honduran company with European finance from European banks were trying to build a hydroelectric dam against the wishes of the community. And again, the community, like in the case in Turkana, said that they weren't consulted, and they opposed the construction of the dam. And hitmen that have been proven in court to have been hired by the company assassinated the leaders, including this woman's mother, which shows you that those who are brave enough sometimes to stand up and speak on behalf of their community and take on these interests are taking on very powerful vested interests, and sometimes can pay the ultimate price. As I mentioned, we're all very connected to this, and this is a photograph. You may recall this disaster 9 years ago in Bangladesh, when this building, the Rana Plaza building, collapsed. There hadn't been adequate safety checks, and this 5-story building collapsed, and inside over 1,000 garment workers lost their lives very tragically, and most of them were female. And how are we connected? Well, in this factory, most of the garments were being produced for Western labels, so clothes for pennies, for Benetton and others, which shows you that this issue is, we are all connected. And as Father Kevin mentioned, in the situation in Nigeria, the state is often too weak to enforce laws, or maybe is even compromised, or corruption is rife, which shows why we need stronger laws in Europe, and why we need stronger laws in Ireland, so that our companies, our corporations, can't just blame the weak or the poor conditions in countries further down the supply chain. I just wanted to mention two companies connected with Ireland. One is Airbnb. So Airbnb Ireland. So Airbnb, you probably are aware, there's a holiday booking company, and they have their European headquarters domiciled in Dublin. Now, this photograph here is of a Palestinian in the West Bank, a man named Auni, and behind him you can see his land and some buildings on the land. Now, those buildings are actually an illegal Israeli settlement built on his family's land, and so he can't access his family's farmland where he used to grow barley because of this illegal Israeli settlement. Yet he went on to Airbnb and saw that people from all over the world, you or I, could go onto the Airbnb website, and if we would like to holiday on this poor man's land, we could actually rent out a room in this Israeli settlement behind him. So this shows you again how Irish companies or multinationals based here can be connected through their global activities with some very serious human rights issues. Another one is ESB, the state-owned electricity company, which is connected to a notorious mine in Colombia, in the north of Colombia, called the Cerrejón mine, where for decades there have been well-documented human rights abuses, thousands of people forced off their land, hundreds of thousands of people affected by air pollution with respiratory illnesses, and huge damage to the environment. Yet ESB has imported coal from this notorious mine, which is a dirty fossil fuel, and full stop, but also it's been connected with this particular mine and grave violations of human rights. And I think one of the most important things to say is there's no laws stopping companies from doing this, or there's no laws requiring companies to check their supply chains. There's very weak laws for affected communities to take court cases against European companies or Irish companies. And Father Kevin mentioned the power of campaigning and shareholder activism, and you can win when you come together and you focus. But it's entirely voluntary. That approach relies on shaming the company. And what we'd like to see is a move towards stronger regulations. So let's make it not that the companies police themselves voluntarily, but that there actually is a legal framework which requires companies to check their supply chains, to look into, are there human rights issues happening? Is there exploitation happening? Is there environmental damage happening? Because at the moment it isn't a legal requirement. So yeah, why do we need laws? So as we've illustrated in these cases, and we've heard from Nigeria, these abuses to human rights and damage to the environment are widespread. The approach of voluntary approaches where corporations police themselves hasn't worked. And companies hide behind their global supply chains. They say, oh, that's an issue for Bangladesh. That's an issue for a local company. That's not us. We just source from them. And they try to shirk responsibility and hide behind the complexity of the global economy. It's also at present really complex for survivors to take cases across borders. For instance, in the case of Shell, there was a case that took 14 years for some of the affected communities in the Niger Delta to take a case against Shell. Now, they were successful, and that's very rare. But a number of the plaintiffs died, and in fact, they died before the 14 years passed to take that case. And the case was really expensive. And just last week, one of the plaintiffs died before he had received the compensation. So the laws are clearly not fit for purpose if it takes so much money and so much time to try and get a victory. And there are many cases that didn't result in a victory. And for Ireland, it's also very important. We are a small country, but we are a hub for some of the biggest multinationals in the world. And if we introduce stronger laws here, that could have a really big impact. We could punch above our weight. And the last reason is that there is public support for this. Our coalition did a survey last year, and 81% of Irish people, vast majority of Irish people, want stronger laws on corporate abuses. So we would like to see a move towards new legislation. And very briefly, without getting too technical, I just want to explain how this legislation might work. So there would be two main aims. One would be to prevent abuses from happening in the first instance. So we would like to see corporations do what's called human rights and environmental due diligence. And this would involve companies looking along their supply chains and identifying abuses and ideally preventing these from happening before they happen. And this will be an ongoing process. It wouldn't be a company does it at one point and then forgets about it, that they would continually look at their suppliers, look at their global operations and check, is there human rights abuses? Is there exploitation? Is there potential for environmental damage? And then in terms of accountability, if abuses still do happen, it would be important that companies can't wash their hands and say that's just another company in the supply chain, that an Irish company would have accountability if it has a controlling influence over another company in the supply chain, that victims could take cases against Irish companies through the Irish courts and could face financial penalties. So what would that look like in practice? I'll just give a hypothetical example. So imagine there's an Irish company that is working with a supplier in a garment factory somewhere in Southeast Asia, maybe Bangladesh or Myanmar. And there are local reports, maybe from a trade union, that maybe a living wage isn't being paid, or there's harassment against women, or maybe there's child labor. And if the Irish company didn't didn't go and assess and see if these abuses were happening, then potentially it could face penalties for not doing this assessment, this due diligence practice. Another example would be, say, if there's a country in Africa producing cocoa that an Irish company is importing, and maybe it imports 60% of the cocoa just for this one Irish company, and then child labor is discovered to be happening on the cocoa farms, and that company in Ireland then could potentially face court cases if those communities use the new law to challenge and sue for damages. And then another example would be if there was serious environmental damage. So if there was an Irish oil company that through negligence had a massive oil spill, and then perhaps the company could be taken to court or could face even criminal damages if there was a failure to prevent such harms. So those examples give you an idea of how such a law would work. And I'm not just talking hypothetically here, because the good news is that there is a law in the pipeline. So there's two media articles you can see here from February, when the European Commission announced a new draft EU directive. And so this is really exciting, and we really welcome this. So this new directive is called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and would introduce new legislation along the lines of what I've outlined there, and something we've been campaigning for years on. So we're really excited that we might now be moving from this approach where companies essentially can police themselves to actual new strong legislation that would make them liable and would make them assess their supply chains. Unfortunately, it's very, very weak, and there are a number of loopholes which I want to just go through. And one of the most attention grabbing is that 99% of European businesses will be excluded from these new laws. So great that there are new laws, but if it only applies to 1% of companies, and they'll be the biggest companies in Europe, then it mightn't necessarily be very effective. So if we take a glass half full approach, the good news is that, yeah, it is a landmark shift away from voluntary measures. Companies will now be legally responsible for the actions of their subsidiaries in their supply chains. So this is huge, and communities will be able to take cases through the courts in Europe. It's also stronger than the existing laws in France and Germany. Climate obligations are included in the draft law. And many of the biggest Irish companies will be covered, including ESB and Tullow Oil that I mentioned, Primark, CRH, many other very large Irish companies will be covered by this draft law. So it is, I think Father Kevin mentioned small wins. We need to celebrate small wins. So we're definitely going in the right direction. But with the glass half empty, as I mentioned, it applies to very few companies. So actually fewer than 700 Irish companies will be included by this law, and it's in its form. Now it's in a draft form, I must mention, so there still is opportunity to strengthen it. But there's also dangerous loopholes, such as the way it's currently framed. Companies can sign contracts with suppliers, which would be able to get them to avoid liability and avoid court cases. So that's a very worrying loophole. Also, the barriers to accessing justice are not addressed. So while affected communities will be able to take cases, they won't be supported with legal aid. Other barriers like time limits and group cases won't be addressed. So there's still serious barriers to actually meaningfully enabling communities like in the Niger Delta to be able to take cases. It's also very weak on gender. It's weak on the protection of human rights defenders. And there's 18 plus months ahead for this directive to be finalized. It has to go through the EU institutions, in the EU Parliament, and the EU Council, and it could be watered down further. So we have a battle on our hands. So there is huge potential here. We could have a groundbreaking new law, but there's also potential that it could be watered down and weakened even further, that it could become a tick box exercise. That's what we're really worried, that it doesn't change things in practice. It becomes just a form-filling exercise for companies to do that doesn't actually change the situation on the ground. So that's where we need you to come in and to help us. So on the picture here, you can see Minister of State Robert Troy, who is a minister in the Department of Enterprise, and he has responsibility for this EU directive. So he's the key person in the Irish government. He's a Fianna Fáil minister, and we've managed to meet with him. We met with him just a few weeks ago to discuss this, and he will be the key target now to put pressure on, so that we would love Minister Troy to be going to the negotiations now in Brussels, sitting down with the other EU member states and arguing for as strong a law as possible. So we really need to hear him, for him to hear the voice of people like yourselves that care about this issue and want to see Ireland being a leader on this issue. And I've also included our MEPs, because the European Parliament will have a key role in the coming months as well. So putting pressure on our elected representatives is really important to show them that this is an issue that we care about. So yeah, I think it's really crucial that that we go away and we use the power that we have to try and influence those who can speak on our behalf. So I think I've probably gone over time, so I'm going to leave it at that, because I know John wants to speak more about the idea of writing to these stakeholders. So happy to answer any questions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed, Gary. And you've been very comprehensive and very clear in everything that you presented. And I like the way you began by connecting us all with, whether it's the orange or the phone or the clothes, or indeed the oil, in the same way that Kevin had mentioned to us. But what I also liked too was the fact that you very much told us that there is something that we can do about it. And you also told us that there is great support for a campaign in Ireland, and that people in Ireland are actually quite exercised by some of the issues that you brought up. But one thing that you did identify for us, which was really good, was who exactly the key target is and what exactly can we do about it as AEFJN Ireland or as people who are looking in now. And you mentioned Minister Robert Troy, indeed, and then you mentioned a possibility for later in a few months, perhaps the MEPs and so on. So once again, Gary, thank you very, very much indeed for taking the time to not just make the presentation, but to be so clear. And you needn't worry at all. You didn't go over time. You got everything said, and it was just great. So once again, if anybody has any questions that they would like to put to either Gary or to Father Kevin, we're very happy to try and field some of those questions now before we move on to the next section, which is where we wanted to try and help describe what action it is that we as people who are looking in could actually take based on the experience that Father Kevin has outlined for us and on the policy issues that Gary has identified for us. So I might call on Jerry Ford, who has been monitoring carefully the chat function to see, are there any particular questions that might be there that might have caught his attention. So if anybody still has a question that because I know Gary has just finished, that feel free to keep adding those questions. And again, at the very end, if we have a moment or two, we might come back to those. Jerry, is there anything that has caught your attention there, please?
Yeah, there's been a few questions have come in. And there were for Father Kevin at this stage. We're waiting for ones for our second speaker. Yeah. And for Kevin, maybe the first question is, can you give us examples of how abuses, human rights abuses, impacted on the lives of the people that you have encountered?
You have to unmute, Father Kevin.
I'll give you an example of the Joint Task Force. The Joint Task Force is a security combination of Army, Navy, Air Force, police. They are the ones who protect these multinational oil companies. And in the place where I was working in Bielsa, two young guys were taken away one night by these security people because they had stolen some property belonging to a multinational. They have never been seen or heard of again. They have gone, they've disappeared. And that is an example of extrajudicial killings. It's an example of abuse. We went to the oil company. They tried everything to see what they could do about it, but nothing happened. So that's why we are engaging oil company and this Ajib oil company now to bring in the UN Global Business Forum to see, can we do something better to improve and protect the local people from abuse by security forces.
Okay, thank you for that. And maybe a second question you could answer as well is, has the government in Nigeria taken any action to regulate Shell and enforce environmental regulation? Or indeed, is there any effective environmental regulation?
There are environmental regulations, yes, they're all on the paper, but when you have inept agencies like the Ministry for Environment and the federal government and Ministry of Environment and agencies like Nostra, and they have no funds, they can't do anything. They are easily won over by the companies, and the company gets their way. So really, the government has not shown a sincerity of purpose about how to deal with these companies with regards to laws and regulations.
Okay, and before moving on to Gary, just maybe one final question for you, Kevin. You've touched upon corruption, and to what extent have you found that corruption causes or exacerbates human rights abuses?
Well, again, let me go back to the Bielsa state where I worked. We have had 3 people from that state who were the Minister for Petroleum. The most recent one, a lady who is now in exile in the UK, and she has alleged to have taken billions of dollars out of the area. Now, all the money that these 3 individuals have taken out of the state, And that's why we don't have hospitals, we don't have schools, we don't have the proper facilities in Bielsa. Bielsa is an oil and gas rich state, but it's a third world country, and that's crazy to have such resources, such funds. It has been taken away, stolen by individuals, and we have nothing but poverty.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thanks indeed. And Jerry, actually, there's a question here too for Gary that I see now. Somebody has just put in, they said they're just wondering why the upcoming EU directive only covers 1% of companies. Is there a reason for that?
Very good question, and I'd ask it myself as well. And it's something we are asking of the EU, because yeah, we think it's simply not good enough. I suppose the counter argument is that for very small businesses or medium enterprises, that it would be too excessive, the costs for them to assess all of their suppliers across the globe, and so it should only apply to large businesses. And I suppose there is a certain logic to that. But what we're arguing for is that this process of due diligence would be proportional to the size of the company, and to the size of the company, but also the sector you're in and the risk that you might be facing. And there was a study done actually by the European Commission which showed that the cost of doing due diligence would be less than 0.1% for the company. So it's not going to cripple small business. And I think what we would say is that the UN have developed guiding principles on business and human rights, and they outline that human rights is the responsibility of all businesses. It shouldn't just be for some businesses. So the EU directive is really promising, but if it only applies to 1% of businesses, it's not good enough. And at the end of the day, it isn't going to be impactful if it only applies to so few businesses.
That's great, thanks. Knowledge is power, as you say. If everybody knows everything, that would help it a lot better. There's a question here from Scholastic, I think, who's coming to us from South Sudan, and she asked, to what extent would you say that success has been achieved in holding these destructive companies accountable for the environmental damage that they continue to cause in their host countries?
Yeah, great question, and it's hard to maybe evaluate the extent of success. I mean, I would say that there have been successful cases. I mentioned Shell earlier, and Shell is actually one where there have been multiple cases that have been successful, and there was quite a landmark ruling last year in the Netherlands which held Shell responsible for the carbon emissions of the extraction of oil, so not just the impact on the local community. And that was quite a landmark ruling which has required Shell now to reduce their carbon emissions in line with the Paris Agreement, which is the first time that a company has been asked to reduce emissions like countries have to do under Paris. So taking action through the courts can result in successes and hold companies accountable. But it's a bit piecemeal, to be honest. And I think these cases, as I mentioned, are very expensive, time consuming, and the odds are stacked against us. There was a recent report called Suing Goliath, which went through a number of these case studies. I'd recommend it. It's an excellent resource. But that image, that it is very much a David versus Goliath struggle to try and take on these huge companies with armies of lawyers. And the way the laws are at the moment, the odds are incredibly against the affected communities. So that's why we'd like to see new laws that would make it, which would be stacked in the victim's favor, that would give them support, which would give them easy access to the courts in Europe. And then I think we'd see many more victories, and we'd see many more companies being held accountable.
Gary, thank you very much indeed, and very comprehensively answered. I have to say, even the name of a report, Suing Goliath, kind of says it all, really, doesn't it? At this stage, I think we might move on a little bit, but thank you all, and thanks to those who have put in the questions. And we may have time for one or two more at the end, but we'll judge that as we get a little bit closer. But at this stage, I'd like to move on because earlier, just a few minutes ago, you heard Father Kevin talk of his experience, and then you heard Gary bring us through the policy and some of the detail as it applies, excuse me, with regards to the proposed legislation. But now we'd hope to encourage you to participate by taking an action. And I'd like to introduce you to John McGeady, who is the OLA Justice Officer working for the Missionary Sisters of Our Lady of Apostles. John is also the chair of the AEFJN Ireland antenna. And John is now going to move this discussion on as he describes how you can be involved. So John, you're very welcome, and thanks for all that you've done in preparing for this. So John, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Brian, and thanks very much to Father Kevin and to Gary for your contributions, for your input, and really for your testimony, and also to Jerry for collecting the questions from the audience as well. I suppose then, just following on essentially, and we'll keep this relatively brief, but following on from what Gary talked about, the proposed legislation that's presently before the European Union, there is an opportunity for us as citizens, Irish citizens here in Ireland, and for those of you who are outside Ireland, in other European countries, as citizens of the European Union, to take this opportunity now to lobby and to advocate for the sort of robust, effective due diligence legislation that Gary's talking about, the Corporate Accountability Directive that's currently before the EU. So we're recommending here at AEFJN Ireland that you download and print a letter that we prepared that will be sent to the Minister Robert Troy, whom Gary mentioned, calling on him to really proactively support this legislation. Not just to say, yeah, that's EU legislation and we'll sign it when it comes along, but really to progress it in the European Union, to work with his colleagues in the Council of Ministers, so that this is robust, meaningful legislation that doesn't just cover 1%, as one of the members in the audience asked, but that actually covers the 100%. And that does so in a sensible, logical, reasonable way, as Gary mentioned, in a way that's proportionate, but that it would cover all those people. And also, as Gary mentioned, this problem of having access to justice for people who have had their human rights abused, that the legislation would really give them that ability to take action and to have their rights granted to them. So what I might just do now is I'll screen share the letter, and maybe Brian, if you could do that for me, please. And we'll just go through the letter. It's one page. So you can see here at the beginning, there's a space there in red for your own address and for the date, okay? I would really encourage you to print it this evening, whenever you finish this call, and Brian will also pop it into the chat so that you can just download it and print it if you have a printer available there. But obviously put in your name and your address and put in whatever date that you printed and sign it. The address, this is going to Robert Troy. At this point in the process, the Council of Ministers has a major role in shaping the legislation. In a few weeks and a few months, whenever the committees in the European Parliament are established, the MEPs, the members of the European Parliament, will have a much bigger role in progressing this legislation. And at that point, we would encourage you to think about adapting this letter. And in fact, what we might do is, with your permission, we'll send you on another letter that you can print and sign if you so wish, and we would encourage you to do so to your MEPs at that point in the process. But for now, the most valuable target, the person who has who is it's most worth contacting, is Minister Robert Troy at the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. So his address is there on the letter, and obviously you stick that in the front of your envelope. And then we have, Dear Minister Troy, I write to you regarding my concern about the adverse impact some corporations have on human rights and the environment. I ask that you proactively support the proposed EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. This is the corporate accountability law we're talking about. And work with your colleagues in the Council of Ministers to ensure that the directive is robust and effective. Now, many of you on this call, if not most of you, are religious, and you may be members of, well, you obviously will be members of communities if you're religious, and therefore you may choose to send this letter from your community or from a number of sisters, fathers, or brothers. And in that case, obviously adapt the letter appropriately. So we write to you regarding whether I write to you. You know yourself exactly what you're doing. So companies have an enormous impact on people's lives and the communities in which they operate. Indeed, we've heard that already now from Father Kevin this evening and from Gary. Global complex global value chains allow some corporations to turn a blind eye to human rights abuses in their supply chains. Indeed, there have been media reports of companies based in Ireland, such as the ESB and Airbnb Ireland, which have been linked to serious human rights violations around the world. And again, we've heard about those from Gary this evening as well. So the activities of corporations have contributed to the erosion of workers' rights, to environmental destruction, as we heard from Kevin, and to forced and child labour. And in 2021, the US Department of Labour identified 156 items from 77 countries produced by child or forced labour. And communities living in areas of great natural wealth are being trampled upon, again, as we heard from Gary this evening. Reprisals against those who speak out are often brutal. 227 human rights defenders were killed in 2020. Again, Father Kevin told us about the story of people murdered in Nigeria. Yet there are few effective mechanisms to hold companies to account and no global regulation, despite the transnational nature of many businesses. Government has a duty to protect human rights and create the conditions for social justice. That profits are enhanced through human rights violations is an affront to the dignity of the person and undermines human solidarity. When faced with such injustice, we are morally obliged to act decisively. And again, as Gary mentioned, that report is called Suing Goliath. And of course, coming from a faith perspective, we understand from the story of David and Goliath that we have to have the moral courage to take a stand whenever we see injustice. So it is deeply encouraging to see the EU take action on corporate accountability. If done right, the proposed Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive could significantly improve human rights in global supply chains. Given Ireland's long-standing commitment to human rights, we ask that you make a special effort to ensure the directive is strong enough to make a difference. At present, there are 3 key areas that need to be improved in this directive, and Gary already touched upon them. Increase the scope of companies included. At present, 99% of businesses will be excluded from the new EU rules. Enable justice for victims. Significant barriers remain to the ability of communities to take complex and expensive cases against EU companies. And address dangerous loopholes. Companies may be able to avoid court cases through signing contractual clauses with suppliers. And of course, that defeats the purpose of such legislation. So we finish by asking, I trust that you will do your best, and I look forward to hearing from you. And yours sincerely. And then again, at the bottom, we've just marked and read your signature, and you sign your name or the names of the sisters in your community or the fathers or brothers in your community. So that's been dropped into the chat function. I'd encourage all of you now, take a moment to click on that and to download it. And then if you are hooked up to your printer already, or if you aren't, when the call finishes, hook your laptop or your tablet up to or your phone by Wi-Fi or Bluetooth up to your printer and print the letter. Make whatever changes you need to make, print the letter and sign it. And obviously under your name, sign your signature in handwritten pen as well. So please, we really do encourage you to send that letter. We've heard about the successes Kevin has had with shareholder responsibility. We've heard about how communities can make a difference, and we've heard how politicians do want to hear from their constituents and take action when their constituents ask them to do so. We are the constituents of people like Minister Robert Troy. It's up to us to tell him what we want him to do and what we want government to do. Okay, it's important to tell government what we want them to do. That's their function, and that's our function as citizens. So I encourage you all, please, to do that, and please let us know if you get responses. Generally, ministers will respond to letters, but let us know. And of course, the more he receives, the more he'll realize this is something that people in Ireland care about, and it's something that the Irish government, as representatives of the people of Ireland, need to take action on. Okay, so I'll hand back to you, Brian. Thanks very much, everybody.
That's great, John. Thank you very much indeed for a very clear presentation and a great letter, because it's literally down to one page. And as we said, we've dropped it into the chat. And as John has asked, if you're hooked up, you might download it, print it off, sign it, and get ready to send it. Because if we do it now, it's something that's done. And also too, that we might encourage judges to share it. We're kind of coming up against the clock at the minute, but there is one particular question that I might just throw out there. It just asks, Donald Dorr has asked, is there a danger that if our Minister Troy works proactively on this issue, he will in fact be under great pressure from TNCs based in Ireland to water down the proposed law rather than to enhance it? Would we not need to lobby green TVs and others or to lobby green TVs and others to work on Minister Troy, so not just ourselves, but to other TDs to work on Minister Troy as well as those who attended the meeting. John or Gary?
John,
And maybe I'll bring Gary in as well.
Yeah,
sure. Yeah. Just a quick response from my side. The minister is going to be under pressure from TNCs anyway. There's a huge corporate lobby, not just in Ireland, but across Europe, that is pushing back on this. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's only applying to 1% of business, is because they've been very successful already in watering it down. And I think that's why we need as much counter pressure as we can. So I think, every single letter counts that goes into the minister to support him, and that he knows that there is a constituency of concerned citizens on this issue. And we have, in the Irish coalition, we've engaged with the Green Party, and because it isn't their ministerial portfolio within the coalition, they keep telling us to go talk to Robert Troy. So I think he is the primary person. So if you're just sending one letter, I'd send it to Troy. But I think it would be good for the Green Party to know that there is support on this. So if you'd like to write a second letter, I'd write into the Green Party as well.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Gary. You have answered that perfectly. But I think the first step, as John said, is in the hope that we will try and encourage those who are in attendance this evening to take the letter, print it off and sign it. So, you know, as we come to the end of the webinar, I suppose, I can actually show you, I don't know whether you can see it or not, but I have actually printed off mine and I have written my address and I have it ready to go. So first thing in the morning, I'm ready to go with this. Because as I said earlier, if I don't do it now, there's a chance I might forget, with the best willing in the world. So my intention also is to share this letter with others in the hope that others who are a bit like-minded like myself might also try and do exactly as we're going to do this evening. My plan too is to post the letter rather than to email it, because I'm hoping that I will get a reply in writing to my office, because that's really what I'm after. I want them, if I'm going to some effort, I want them to go to some effort. And as John mentioned earlier, that our initial target is Minister Robert Troy at the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. And towards the end of the summer, maybe in early September, as Gary mentioned when he was speaking, we hope to scale up our campaign to take our concerns to Europe. And we hope that we could count on your support, or your continuing support. So in that vein, we would hope to come back to you, which we will do anyway, because we intend to come back to you with the recording of the webinar, with maybe some of the slides and some of the photographs, with the letter that John has prepared, so that you will be able to take this and have that link to share with others, or to use again if that's what you'd like to do. Just to remind you also too, that if there are others who are watching in who are maybe have some links to Africa and would like to know a little bit more about what is AEFJN Ireland and whether or not they might consider linking in with us, we'd love to hear from you. You can contact us through the AMRI site or through aefjnireland@gmail.com, or equally too, you can respond to the link that we will send out to you in due course with the response, with the recording. So I would like to take the opportunity really just to thank you for watching in, and I hope that you've been inspired to take the action that John has outlined. I can see John has a hand there. John, was there something you'd like to add there before we finally thank everybody to close? Thanks.
Yeah, just to add there, if I can, Brian, somebody put into the chat, it was actually Sister Elizabeth in Tanzania. So hello, Sister Elizabeth. The question, what about those of us not in Europe?
Good question. And
I would simply say, print the letter and send it anyway. Because, you know, Robert Troy may be the minister in the Irish government, but that doesn't mean that he's not going to at least listen to what somebody from another country has to say. You know, so it certainly can't do any damage to send it, and hopefully it'll actually help. So for those of you who maybe aren't in the EU, and particularly those of you in the UK, for example, by all means, send the letter anyway. You know, whether it's to an Irish minister or whether you send it on to other MEPs in the European Parliament or other ministers, do that anyway, because I think that's also important as well, that they hear from people, and particularly for those of you living in African countries, that they hear from people in countries maybe that are experiencing some of the issues that Father Kevin has spoken about in Nigeria, for example, or in any other countries where such abuses may be occurring. So thanks very much. Okay, back to you, Brian.
Thank you. Thanks, John, indeed, for that. So lastly then, to say that if you actually get a response from the minister, you might let us know how you got on. If he does reply to, if I get something, I'll certainly come back to you with it. And then once we kind of gathered ourselves over the summer, we'll come back to you with the next steps, and hopefully we'll come together again to take us through the next part of our journey. So lastly, before we leave you this evening, I'd sincerely like to thank Father Kevin O'Hara and his friend beside him, I'm afraid I don't know his name, who helped him out this evening, and Gary Walsh, of course, and John McGeady for their care of their preparation and their clarity of thought in all the presentations this evening. I'd also like to thank Tony Pike from Amroy for her work in assisting us in the preparation of the webinar. And I'd like to thank also Michelle Robertson, who works as part of the OLA Communications, who had helped us in the early stages of preparing the social media and preparing the flyer and the links and all of that kind of thing. And then Jerry Ford, who's been monitoring things in the background for us, has been involved at every stage too. So Jerry, and to all others who are looking in this evening, just to thank you very much indeed for taking the time to look in with us this evening. So there we have it. So as we take our leave of you, we'd ask you maybe to think on how you might best celebrate Africa Day tomorrow, which happens to be May 24th tomorrow. And we would think that the best way you can do it is by taking the action that we've encouraged this evening. And maybe we will have some of those small wins that encourage us to do more, as both Kevin and Gary have informed us. So with that, we leave the link open for another 10 minutes or so if people want to have a chat or if people have something they'd like to say. But once again, just to thank you all indeed for taking the time to be with us this evening. So thanks again. Take care.